Petey Malloy was 19 the night I watched him get robbed under a parking lot light and say nothing at all. He stood by his truck in the yellow wash of the sodium lamp, out behind Corliss Stamping, and he opened his pay envelope the way careful boys do. Slow, thumb under the flap. He counted it twice. I was 30 feet away, locking up the timekeeper's window, and I could read his shoulders from there. $6 short. Same as last week. Same as the week before that. And you know what he did? He folded that envelope in half. He put it in his shirt pocket. He got in his truck and he drove home. Because a job at Corliss was a job, and a boy who argues with the office doesn't stay a boy with a job. $6. Doesn't sound like much, but it was $6 stolen off a welder who wasn't old enough to buy a beer, and it was the same 6 every Friday, and it was happening to 24 men on that floor at once. Here is how they took it. The night super, a man named Vernon Holt, had shaved 18 minutes off every man's card again. Not once. Every shift. Petey asked him about it one time, real polite, hat in his hands, and Vernon pointed up at the big clock bolted to the wall over the time rack, and he said, "The clock's the clock, son. You want to argue, argue with the clock." 24 men heard him say it. Not one of them said a word. Now part of my job, the card lady, the woman nobody watched, was to feed the spent punch cards to the incinerator every quarter. Vernon's standing order: get rid of the old cards, keep the records room clean. So the next morning I carried the box down to the furnace room. Same as always. I just never opened the furnace door. If you believe quiet people read the fine print, this story is for you. Before I tell you the rest, do me one small thing. Hit that subscribe button, and down in the comments, tell me the town you're watching from. I want to see how far a story about an honest clock can travel. Go on. I'll wait. All right. Let me start at the beginning, and let me start it calm. Corliss Stamping Works sat at the end of Factory Street in Delano, Ohio, autumn of 1971. It was a low brick building with a smokestack and a gravel lot, and it stamped steel parts for tractors and washing machines and things you never think about until they break. I kept the time there for 26 years. That was my whole job. My whole authority in the world was a rubber date stamp, a good memory, and a rack of cards with a man's name on each one. You should understand what a timekeeper was. When a man came in, he pulled his card from the rack, slid it into the clock, and the clock punched the hour on it. In, out, that was your day, printed in ink. At the end of the pay period, those little printed numbers turned into a man's rent, into groceries, into his kids' shoes. I was the one who added them up. So I knew things. I knew whose card came in with grease on the corner because he'd been under a truck before shift. I knew whose hand shook a little on Monday mornings. I knew whose wife was sick, because a man whose wife is sick punches in early and stares at nothing. The night crew was my people. I ran the day book, but I came in at the shift change, and I saw them all cross over. Big men, most of them. Tired men. Good ones. There was a fellow named Sam who'd worked there 30 years and never missed a day. Not even the day they buried his brother. There was young Petey Malloy, who wanted to make apprentice welder more than he wanted to breathe, and who thought if he just kept his head down and worked hard, the world would be fair to him. I want you to hold on to that boy, because everything that comes next, I did for him and men like him. I'm telling you they were worth something before I tell you they got robbed. That matters. You have to love the honest clock before you can hate the man who breaks it. The first crack showed up in the numbers, the way it always does with me. Numbers are how I see the world. It was a Tuesday. I was doing what I did every pay period, matching Vernon's tabulation sheet against the actual cards. His sheet was the summary, the hours he reported up to payroll. The cards were the truth, the ink the clock had punched. And that Tuesday, they didn't match. His sheet said the crew worked fewer hours than their cards showed. Not by a lot. A few minutes a man. But a few minutes across 24 men adds up to a whole shift's pay walking out the door. I didn't think theft. Not yet. You don't when you've worked somewhere 26 years. You think error. So I did the polite thing. I walked over to Vernon's desk with my sheet and his sheet, and I laid them side by side, and I said, "Vernon, the totals don't match the cards. The cards show more." He didn't even look up all the way. He had this way of looking at you like you were furniture that had learned to talk. "The clock runs fast at night," he said. "I correct for drift." Drift, that was the word he used. Like time was a boat that had slipped its mooring, and he was just tying it back up. I said, "All right, Vernon," and I went back to my window. But I want you to notice what I did that night, because it's the whole story in one small motion. I got out my own log, a black composition book I kept in my drawer, the kind with the marbled cover, and I wrote the date. And I wrote what he'd said. 10:12. V. Holt says clock runs fast, corrects for drift. Cards read higher than his sheet. Just the date and the fact. I didn't know why I did it. I told myself it was for the error, so I'd have it straight when they fixed the clock. That was the lie I told myself. 26 years of habit, writing down what the day actually was. I couldn't stop myself if I tried. The second crack came from Marge. Margaret Dockery. Marge Two Hands, the men called her, because she could do a job with each hand at the same time and shame you doing it. She was the line floor forewoman, 55 years old, and she was the one person in that building I told things to. She came to my window one evening with her jaw set the way it got when something wasn't square. "You dock a man for clocking in wet?" she said. "What do you mean wet?" Owen came in soaked through, it was raining sideways. And Vernon told him he was late because he stood under the eave shaking off before he punched. Docked him 15 minutes for it. For not wanting to drip on the floor. Now that made no sense, and I said so. And Marge said, "Pull his card." So I pulled Owen's card. And here's the thing. The card read full time. The clock had punched him in on the hour. There was no 15 minutes missing on the card. The 15 minutes went missing on Vernon's sheet, after the card left my rack and before the numbers went up to payroll. The clock told the truth. The man in the middle changed it. Marge and I stood there under my little green lamp, and we pulled 3 more cards. Men who'd come to her complaining about short checks. Every one. Card said one thing, Vernon's sheet said less. Every single time the difference went one direction, the company's direction. His direction. You could call one card an error. You could maybe call 2 an accident. 4 cards, all shorted the same way? That's not drift. That's a decision. I wrote a note. A real one this time, typed, businesslike. I addressed it to Vernon Holt, and I asked him, in writing, so there'd be a record, to please provide the drift correction figures in writing so I could reconcile the cards to his sheet. Polite, formal, the kind of thing a careful clerk sends. He never answered it. Not a word. He walked past my window every night for 2 weeks like that note had never crossed his desk, and that told me more than any answer could have. An honest man explains himself. A guilty one pretends he never heard the question. Now here's a small thing I never mentioned to anyone. I want to tell it to you plainly, the way it happened, because later it becomes the whole story. Part of my job was to burn the spent cards each quarter. Vernon's standing order, like I said, keep the records room clear. I'd been carrying boxes down to that furnace for years. Everybody knew I did it. It was so ordinary nobody thought about it twice. I just never mentioned that. Lately, the boxes I burned were mostly scrap paper. Old memos. Blank stock. The real cards I'd started keeping. I told myself it was because the numbers didn't match, and I might need them. That was true. But there was another reason I didn't say out loud even to Marge. I didn't trust the furnace anymore. Not with a thing that could tell the truth. Then came the night on the floor, and after that night, there was no pretending it was drift. Vernon called a shift meeting. He didn't do that often. He climbed up on a pallet so he'd be taller than everybody, which tells you most of what you need to know about the man, and he waited for the presses to go quiet. 24 men gathered around in their aprons and their safety glasses, tired, wanting to go home. He said there was going to be a clock recalibration. Said the time clock had been reading generous, and to true it up, he was docking the whole crew a quarter hour. 15 minutes off everybody's shift, starting that night. To fix the drift, he said. Same word. Drift, 15 minutes off 24 men. Do that math. That's 6 full hours of paid work, vanishing every single shift, and not 1 minute of it coming out of Vernon Holt's pocket. And that's when Petey, 19 years old, God love him, raised his hand. Not to make trouble. You could see he'd worked up his nerve for it. He said, "Mr. Holt, my checks have been coming up short for a while now. Even before tonight. I want to understand where the minutes are going." The floor went dead quiet. You could hear the ventilation fans, and Vernon Holt looked down at that boy from up on his pallet, and he said, "You want your minutes? Go count them somewhere else. You're done. Get your things." Fired him, on the spot. For asking a question. Called it insubordination. 24 men stood there in the fluorescent light and watched a boy get thrown out for the crime of adding up his own pay, and not one of them said a word. Including me. I was standing in the doorway with my clipboard, and I said nothing, because I was afraid, and because I told myself there was nothing to say. I've thought about that silence every day since. 24 men and me. All of us heard him. All of us saw it. That whole room full of witnesses, and the account stayed open, unpaid, for a long, long time. But it closed. I promise you it closed. Keep watching, because it closed in that same room, in front of those same eyes. Here's what they don't show you about a firing like that. It doesn't end at the gate. Petey couldn't get on anywhere. He tried the foundry over in Marysville. He tried the parts plant. He tried a garage that needed a welder and would have been glad to have him, and the man there liked him fine. Shook his hand, told him to come back Monday, and then called him Sunday night to say it wasn't going to work out after all. Sorry, son, nothing personal. It was personal. Vernon had made calls. That's what a man like that does with his little bit of power. He didn't just take the boy's job. He made sure the boy couldn't feed himself in the whole county, because Petey had asked a question out loud, and a question out loud is a threat to a man running a skim. I watched Petey come back one last time to clean out his locker. He didn't slam anything. He didn't curse. He just packed his welding gloves and his lunch pail and a little transistor radio into a cardboard box, and he carried it out past my window, and he nodded at me. Polite to the end. 19 years old, and already learning that the world takes what it wants from people who can't fight back. That's the night it tipped in me. Not the fear. The fear was still there. But something underneath it went hard and cold and certain. Because standing at my window, watching that boy carry his box to his truck, I finally understood the shape of the thing. It wasn't drift. It had never been drift. Those shaved minutes weren't a mistake or a clock reading generous. They were a system. Somebody had been running it, quietly, for a long time. And I, the card lady, the furniture that added up numbers, I was the only person alive who had ever held the original cards in my hands. The only one who could prove what the clock really said, against what Vernon Holt claimed it said. The company didn't keep those cards. Payroll worked off Vernon's sheets. The auditors, if there ever were any, worked off payroll. The only truth left in the whole building was in a rack at my window and in boxes I was supposed to burn. I stayed late that night, long after the shift change, long after the lot emptied out. I sat in the records room with a single lamp on, and I did something I'd never let myself do. I stopped looking at one pay period. I went back. I pulled the old tabulation carbons. Vernon kept carbon copies of his sheets, filed by year. Because he was the kind of man who trusts his own records to protect him and never once imagines they might hang him. And I pulled the cards I'd been quietly keeping, and I started at the beginning, and I matched them. I want to tell you exactly what I found. Because the mechanism is the whole crime, and it's simpler and uglier than you'd think. Vernon reported the crew short, every man a few minutes a shift. Those minutes turned into hours on paper, and those hours turned into dollars the company thought it was saving. But the company wasn't saving that money. That's the part I hadn't seen. If Vernon just shorted the men, the payroll total would drop, and drop, year after year, and somebody upstairs might eventually ask why the night shift got so cheap. So the money had to go somewhere. It had to keep the books looking normal, and here's how he did it. There was a name on the night payroll. E. Dunmore, a welder. Drew $140 a week, steady, for years. There was no E. Dunmore, there never had been. I'd worked there 26 years and kept the card rack myself, and there was no card for any Dunmore. Because a phantom doesn't punch a clock. The stolen minutes from 24 real men flowed into one fake man's paycheck. The books balanced. Payroll went out, same total as always, nothing to raise a flag. And every Friday, somebody cashed E. Dunmore's check. That was the trick. That's why it was invisible. The men lost a little, spread thin so nobody could prove it alone. And it all pooled into a name that only existed on paper. A man made of stolen minutes. I sat with that a long time. Then I did the thing that felt natural to me. The only kind of power I've ever had. I got out clean sheets of paper and a pencil, and I copied. 1 full year of it. Every man, every shift. The card figure and Vernon's figure side by side, and the running total of the difference. And E. Dunmore's checks lined up against it. In my own hand. Slow and neat, the way I do everything. But I had a question I couldn't answer yet. Who cashed those checks? Whose account did E. Dunmore's $140 land in? The name was a mask. I needed the face behind it. I didn't know yet. But I knew where to go looking, and I knew that when it came out, it would come out in front of everybody, or it wasn't worth coming out at all. There was one more thing I had to do before I could act. I had to be sure of what I actually had. Not the copies. The originals. I went down to the furnace room. It was late, the plant humming its empty night hum, and I turned on the bare bulb over the incinerator. Against the far wall were the card boxes. Years of them, stacked and labeled in my own writing. To anybody who glanced in, they were trash waiting to burn. Vernon had walked past them 100 times and never given them a thought, because who thinks about the card lady's boxes? I'd built those boxes myself. Each one had a false bottom, just a second panel of cardboard I'd fitted in, with scrap paper piled on top to sit at the right height. Anyone opening a box saw old memos, blank forms, the kind of dead paper you'd expect. That's what I burned when Vernon told me to burn. I lifted the false bottom out of the first box. And there they were. 9 years of original night shift punch cards, real ones, banded together by year with rubber bands and butcher's string, every man's ink, every shift the clock had ever honestly punched. 1962, 1963, all of it. 9 years the company thought had gone up the chimney, sitting in the dark under a lid of scrap paper, waiting, and on the very top of the first stack, where I'd set it the day everything started to make sense, was one single card, number 0714. Petey Malloy's card. His first night at Corliss. The corner of it was still dark with grease, where he'd handled it after working on somebody's truck before shift, so eager to make a good impression he came in early and got his hands dirty first. His first honest night, printed in ink, kept in the dark by an old woman he barely knew. I stood in that furnace room holding a boy's first day in my hand, and I stopped being afraid. I want to be honest with you, the fear didn't leave because I got brave. It left because I finally had more than the fear. I had the truth, on paper, 9 years deep, and I had a boy's greasy card, and I had a name for the thing at last. It was theft, and I was the timekeeper. And the whole point of a timekeeper is that somebody, somewhere, is keeping time whether the powerful man remembers it or not. Now you might think this is the part where I marched up to Vernon Holt's desk and slapped the cards down and told him I had him. That's how it goes in the pictures. That's not what I did. I'll tell you why. A man like Vernon, cornered alone, he lawyers up, or he shreds, or he calls Harlan Cudahy. That was the plant manager, the one who signed the payroll every week, and never once audited a line of it. The one who trusted his people, which is a genteel way of saying he looked away for 9 years running. If I'd confronted Vernon in that office, it would have been my word. The card lady, against the night super and the manager. And I would have lost. Quiet people lose that fight every time. So I didn't confront anybody. I went home. I slept on it one night. And the next morning, I didn't drive to the plant. I drove to Columbus. I put my hand-copied figures in a manila envelope on the seat beside me, and I drove 2 hours to the State Bureau of Labor. And I walked into an office that smelled like burnt coffee and old paper, and I filed a written wage complaint against Corliss Stamping Works. I laid out 1 clean year of it for the intake clerk, the cards versus the sheets, the shorted men, the phantom named E. Dunmore drawing a paycheck. I asked, in writing, for a formal audit of the night payroll. The clerk was a tired young fellow who'd probably heard 100 complaints that went nowhere. But he read 3 lines of my sheet, and he went quiet, and he read the rest. Then he took out a rubber stamp. A rubber stamp. Same as mine. Funny how it comes back around, and he pressed the date onto my complaint. Received, and he gave me a copy with the ink still wet. That stamp was the smallest sound, a little thump of rubber on paper. But sitting in that hard chair in Columbus, I heard it land like a lock turning. Because a complaint like that doesn't sit in a drawer. It starts something. A machine, slow and patient and a great deal bigger than Vernon Holt, began, in that moment, to turn. And there was no calling it back now. Not by him. Not by Cudahy. Not by me. I drove home that afternoon, the same quiet card lady I'd always been. I went in that night, and I stamped cards at my window, and I said "Evening, Vernon," when he passed, and I gave nothing away. But somewhere in a state building 2 hours south, my name was on a paper, and a date was stamped beside it, and the clock, the real clock, the one that doesn't run fast or slow for anybody. The clock had finally started counting against Vernon Holt. He just didn't know it yet. And I had no idea, driving home in the last gold light of that October afternoon, exactly how close he was going to come to finding out. The weeks that followed had a peculiar texture, like fabric that looks plain from across the room, and you get close and see it's full of thread, every color, pulled tight. I came in each morning at 6:30. I hung my coat on the same hook. I made the coffee. Holt took his with 2 sugars, always had, and I put 2 sugars in it without thinking, the way you button your coat without looking at your hands. Muscle memory is a strange mercy. It keeps the face still when the mind is working hard in another room entirely. Petey Malloy's locker was empty. Someone had taken his padlock. I didn't look at it more than once. The cards came through my window the same as always. Grease-edged, cold-handled, the men's breath visible in the early dark. I took each one. I stamped it. I stacked it. My hands knew the work the way a pianist's hands know scales. They do it without being asked. And because my hands were busy and my face was still, nobody looked twice at me. That was the thing about being the card lady for 26 years. I had become part of the furniture of the place. Chairs don't keep secrets. Clocks don't watch you. I did not hear from Columbus for 11 days. On the 12th day, a letter arrived at the plant's front office addressed to Harlan Cudahy, care of Corliss Stamping Works, from the State Bureau of Labor. I know this because Irene Vosberg, who ran the front desk, mentioned it at lunch. She was curious, she said. Never seen a state letter come that way before. I said I wouldn't know anything about state letters and poured myself more coffee, and that was that. Cudahy called Holt into his office that same afternoon. I couldn't hear the words. But I was at my window, and I watched Holt cross the floor toward the stairs, and his walk was wrong. Too straight. The walk of a man who has been told something and is deciding how he feels about it. He came to my window on his way back down. He stood there a moment without saying anything. I kept stamping. "Ruth," he said. "Vernon, you hear anything about some kind of audit?" I looked up. I gave him the same face I'd given him for 26 years, steady, incurious, the face of a woman whose world is punch cards and coffee cups and the correct spelling of men's surnames. "An audit?" I said. "What kind of audit?" "Labor Bureau," he said. "Some kind of routine look at the payroll." I let a beat pass, same as you'd do if you were hearing something for the first time and turning it over. "Well," I said, "I imagine they do those from time to time. And then, because the silence needed filling, and an innocent woman would fill it, you want me to pull anything together for them? I can have the current quarterly reports on your desk by Friday." He looked at me. Through me, really, the way you look through a window at the street beyond it and don't actually see the glass. "No," he said. "No, don't do anything. I'll handle it." "All right, Vernon." He walked away. I stamped another card. My hand was perfectly steady. That Friday, he came to my window before the first shift and told me to pull the old cards, anything older than 3 years, and get them down to the furnace room. "We don't need auditors poking through the trash," he said. And he said it like a man disposing of a small and ordinary problem. Like taking leaves to the curb. "I'll get to it over the weekend," I said. "Quiet time." He nodded and moved on. Saturday morning, I came in on my own time. I loaded 2 document boxes with blank paper, requisition sheets, outdated posting notices, the kind of administrative sediment that accumulates in a records room and means nothing to anyone. I carried those boxes down to the furnace room. Same as I'd done for years. Fed them in. Latched the door. Watched the paper catch. The heat came up through the grate and warmed my hands. I drove home and had a sandwich and sat in the kitchen for a while with the radio on low. Tommy Edwards singing something slow. The afternoon came through the curtains orange and long, and I thought about 9 years of cards in a Prince Albert tin and 4 banded boxes in the trunk of my Rambler. And I thought about the date stamp on my complaint in Columbus, and I thought that Vernon Holt was standing at the edge of something he could not yet see the bottom of. He thought the cards were ash. He had thought so, in one way or another, for years. That was the thing about contempt. It does the other person's work for them. He'd dismissed me so completely, for so long, that he'd stopped actually seeing me. Just the furniture, just the card lady, just the woman who brought the coffee with 2 sugars, who said yes and moved on. He never once, in 9 years, looked at what I was carrying when I left the building. Monday I came in at 6:30. I hung my coat. I made the coffee. 2 sugars. Vernon took the cup without looking up. He never looked up. That was the whole arrangement between us, and it had held for years. The state examiner came on a Tuesday. His name was Sifford. Young, maybe 30, though he carried himself older the way careful men do. Gray suit, a little worn at the cuffs. He came in through the front, not the floor door. And Irene Vosberg walked him back to the timekeeping office like she was showing a doctor to a sick room. She gave me a look on the way past. She'd seen the letter come. She knew something was moving, even if she didn't know what. Sifford set his case on the corner of my desk and asked if I was Ruth Kessler. I said I was. He said the Bureau had received a complaint regarding night shift payroll at Corliss, and that he was here to review the records the law entitled him to see. He said it plainly, no warmth, no threat. A man reading from the inside of his own training. "Of course," I said. "What do you need?" "Here is the thing I want you to understand. I did not hand that young man a confession. I did not open a drawer and pour 9 years across his lap. That would have been the mistake, the eager mistake, the one that gets a case thrown out before it walks. I gave him exactly what a state examiner is owed, and not one card more. The current tabulation sheets. The active payroll ledger, the one Petey signed every Friday without reading. The posting notices. The requisition log. I let him find the shape of it himself. But I asked him one question. I asked it while I was setting the ledger in front of him, the way you'd mentioned the weather. I said, "You'll want to check whether the number of names on the pay ledger matches the number of men who actually walk through that door." He stopped turning pages. He looked at me for the first time like I was a person and not a filing system. "Why do you say that?" "Because I count the men," I said. "It's my job. I've counted them for 26 years, and I can tell you how many punch in on that floor every night." I straightened the blotter. "The ledger tells a different number." He wrote something down. He didn't ask me what the difference was. He was smart enough not to. He'd find it, and when he found it, it would be his. The state's, not the vengeful invention of a card clerk with a grudge. I wanted it clean. I wanted it to hold in a room full of men who'd swear I was nobody. Before he left, I told him Margaret Dockery would speak to what she saw on the floor. Marge and I had talked it through the week before, in her kitchen, over coffee that was mostly a reason to sit down. 55 years old, hands like a stevedore, and the steadiest woman I ever knew. She'd said, "Ruthie, if you're doing this, I'm standing where you can see me." That was all. That was Marge. Sifford said he'd be in touch. He carried his case back out the front, past Irene, and the trap, though nobody in that building could feel it, was armed. Then Vernon got scared. Not all at once. It came up in him slow, the way water finds the low place. The letter had rattled him. Petey asking about the letter had rattled him worse, and now a stranger in a gray suit had spent an afternoon in the plant and left without shaking Vernon's hand. A man like Vernon lives by who shakes his hand. Thursday, he came to my desk at the end of first shift. "Ruth," he had his thumbs in his belt. "Those old cards. Anything older than 3 years. I want them gone by Friday. All of it. 62, 63, the whole back stock. Down to the furnace." "I burned the first lot Saturday," I said. "Burn the rest." His jaw worked. "And Ruth, I'll come down with you. Make sure it's done right. We've had enough sloppiness around here." There it was. He wanted to watch. For 9 years he had let me carry those boxes down alone, 9 years of not caring what the card lady did with the trash. And now, at the one moment it mattered, he wanted to stand over me and see the flames with his own eyes. "All right, Vernon," I said. "Friday. Quiet time. After the floor clears. I want to tell you about Friday, because Friday is the whole story in one room." The furnace room at Corliss was down a set of iron stairs behind the stamping floor. Low ceiling. One bulb in a cage. The furnace itself was an old riveted thing, big as a car, and when you opened the door the heat came out at you like a living breath. I'd been carrying paper down those stairs for years. My knees knew every step. I brought 2 document boxes, requisition sheets, dead posting notices. Blank forms nobody would ever fill out. Administrative sediment, that's what I'd started calling it in my own head. The silt a records room leaves behind. Vernon came down the stairs behind me. He stood by the wall with his arms crossed and watched me work. I set the boxes on the floor. I opened the furnace door, and the heat rolled up and I felt it dry my eyes. And I began feeding paper in, sheet by handful, the way I always had. I didn't rush it. I didn't hide anything. Because there was nothing to hide, it was blank paper, every scrap of it. And Vernon Holt stood 4 feet away and watched a woman burn nothing at all, and believed with his whole heart he was watching 9 years of his own crimes turn to ash. He even helped near the end. Reached into a box, grabbed a handful, threw it in. Dusted his palms after. Satisfied there, he said. That's that. Now here is what Vernon Holt did not know, standing in that red light with his hands clean. The 9 years of real cards were not in that room. They had never been in that room. They were banded by year in 4 boxes and folded into a Prince Albert tin, and all of it was sitting in the trunk of my Rambler, out in the employee lot, 30 feet from where he was standing. Under the same sodium light Petey Malloy had counted his short check by. The man who ordered them burned had been watching the card lady burn them for years, and every single time he had been watching her burn blank paper. That is the whole quiet joke of it. Contempt had made him blind, and blindness had made him certain. And certainty was the last thing he'd ever be sure of. He went up the stairs first. I latched the furnace door. I turned off the bulb. 2 sugars. Yes, Vernon, same as always. The relief lasted 1 day. Saturday he found the furnace log. I didn't know about it until Monday, but Vernon kept a weight log for burned material, a compliance thing from an insurance man years back, pounds of paper per date, so the plant could show it wasn't dumping. Vernon never read it. But scared men read things they never read before. And when he added up what a plant supposedly burned that Friday, the weight was thin. A box of blank forms doesn't weigh what a box of cardstock weighs. 9 years of pressed cardboard has heft. Blank paper floats. Monday morning he was waiting at my desk before I had my coat off. He didn't say good morning. He put both hands flat on my blotter and leaned down, and his face was a color I'd never seen on him. Where are the 62 cards, Ruth? I hung my coat on the hook. I took my time with it. You told me to burn them, Vernon. The weight's wrong. The furnace log's light. You burned something Friday, but it wasn't 9 years of stock. His voice dropped. Where are the cards? I looked at him. 26 years, and I finally looked at Vernon Holt the way he'd always looked at me, like furniture. Like a small and ordinary problem. You told me to burn them, I said again. You never once asked if I did. He didn't understand what he was hearing. That's the thing about a guillotine. The man under it feels the cold before he understands the shape of it. He straightened up. He told me I was finished at Corliss. He told me he'd have me transferred to the day pool by end of week, filing invoices, no more cards, no more floor. He said a woman my age ought to think about how few places would take her. I said, yes, Vernon, and I meant it, in a way he'd never guess. Yes, this was exactly it. This was the day. The hearing notice came in the afternoon mail. It came addressed to the plant, formal, a second state envelope in the stack, and Irene brought it back herself and set it on Cudahy's desk without a word. A wage hearing. Bureau of Labor. To be held on the premises, in the plant office, 10 days out. Corliss Stamping Works and its officers were directed to appear and produce all records pertaining to night shift payroll for the years 1962 through 1971. Vernon read it over Cudahy's shoulder. I watched his face from the doorway. He still thought the cards were ash. That was the mercy I let him keep. Right up to the end. Let a proud man walk into a room believing the floor is solid. It's kinder than a warning, and it's the only justice the small ones ever get to serve. The morning of the hearing it rained. I remember that because the lot was slick, and I carried the 4 boxes and the tin in 2 trips, and the sodium light was still burning even in the gray of an October afternoon, humming over the wet asphalt. I set everything on a hand truck by the front door, and Irene held it for me, and neither of us said anything. Marge met me in the hall. She had her good coat on. She squeezed my arm once, hard, those 2 hands of hers, and we went in together. The plant office was the biggest room we had that wasn't a factory floor. They'd set a long table in the middle under the fluorescent tubes. Sifford sat at the head with a second man from the bureau and a stack of the current sheets he'd taken weeks before. Cudahy sat to one side, gray already, a man who could feel weather coming in his knees. Vernon sat across from him, freshly shaved, jacket pressed, playing the picture of a wronged superintendent who'd humor the state and get back to running his floor. And along the wall, on a bench, sat 8 of the crew. 8 of the 24. Sam, who'd given 30 years and never missed a day. Owen, who'd been docked a quarter hour for standing under an eave out of the rain. Men with grease worked so far into their knuckles it would never wash out. The same men who'd stood silent on that floor the night Vernon told Petey to argue with the clock. They'd come to watch. Word travels on a night shift. They didn't know what they'd come to watch. They only knew the card lady had asked them to be there, and for some reason, that was enough. Sifford opened it. He stated the complaint. He said the Bureau had conducted a records review and would now hear the matter. He asked Mr. Holt whether the plant maintained original time records for the years in question. Vernon spread his hands. Reasonable, warm even. We keep 3 years active. Examiner, state minimum. Anything older gets destroyed on schedule, fire code, storage, you understand. Those old cards were shredded years ago. He glanced at Cudahy for a nod. It's routine. Shredded, Sifford said. Burned, shredded, disposed of, per policy. Vernon settled back. I'm afraid whatever this is about, we simply don't have records going back that far. Nobody does. Sifford looked at me. I stood up. I brought the hand truck to the end of the table. And I began to set the boxes down, one at a time. And I said the year of each one as I said it. 1962. The box hit the table with a weight you could hear. 1963. Vernon's face did not move, but something behind it did. A shutter coming down. 64. 65. I kept going. 9 years. 4 banded boxes and, last, the Prince Albert tin, which I set down soft, in the center, where the light hit it. Every original night shift card, I said. Punched, dated, and filed. I never burned a one of them. I burned blank paper for years, because the order to destroy the crew's own hours never sat right with me, and I couldn't tell you why until I could. The room was so quiet I could hear the tubes hum. Sifford reached over and cut a band on the 62 box. He lifted a stack. He set his own carbon copies of Vernon's tabulation sheets beside them. The sheets Vernon had filed by year in the records room, never dreaming anyone would hold the two side by side. And he began, calmly, to read the difference out loud. Card says a man worked 8 hours and 11 minutes. Sheet says 7:53. Card says full shift. Sheet says short. Card after card after card, a few minutes stolen from each, and every stolen minute pooled and carried down the ledger to a single line. And this name, Sifford said. He put his finger on the payroll ledger. E. Dunmore, welder, $140 a week, every week, for years. Misty. Holt. Who is E. Dunmore? Vernon said nothing. There's no application on file, Sifford went on. No tax withholding card. No physical. No man by that name ever punched a clock on this floor. Mrs. Kessler counts 24 men on that shift. The ledger pays 25. The 25th is paper. He turned a page. The E. Dunmore checks were endorsed and deposited. We traced the deposits. They went into a personal savings account at the Delano Bank. The account is yours, Mr. Holt. Now Vernon moved. He came half out of his chair. The reasonable warmth was gone, and what was under it wasn't a superintendent anymore. It was a cornered thing. He pointed at the boxes and his voice cracked up out of him. Those cards were shredded years ago. He said it like saying it hard enough could make it true. She's fabricated this. She's had a grudge for years, everybody knows it. The card lady, the those were shredded. I signed the destruction orders myself. I looked at him. "You signed the orders, Vernon," I said. "You gave them to me. And I want you to hear this part clearly, because you never once heard me in 26 years. I put my hand flat on the tin. Every card. Every single one. The clock doesn't forget. I let that sit. And neither did I." He tried, after that, the last thing men like him try. He turned to Cudahy, not to Sifford, not to the state, to Cudahy, the man whose signature had covered him for 9 years, and he said he wanted to talk to Harlan alone, just the two of them, 5 minutes. This could all be handled without turning it into a circus in front of the floor. "No," Sifford said. Just that. No, there would be no room alone. There would be no handshake. Vernon Holt was suspended on the spot, pending charges of wage fraud, and the arrogance that had run that floor like a small kingdom collapsed inward until there was nothing left of it but a man in a pressed jacket demanding a private conversation nobody would give him. Then it was Cudahy's turn. And that was a different kind of terrible. Because Vernon was a thief, and there's a clean anger you can feel for a thief. Cudahy was just a man who looked away. 60 years old, plant manager, the one who signed the payroll every Friday and never once ran his eye down the column. "I trust my people," he'd said, for years. And what that meant was, he never wanted the headache of checking. He'd signed 9 years of theft with a steady hand, because reading it would have cost him a quiet afternoon. Sifford laid the total in front of him. $58,900 in withheld wages. 9 years. 24 men. $6 a check, 18 minutes a night. 6 full hours of paid work vanishing every single shift, multiplied out across all those winters until it came to that number. Plus the phantom line. Sifford slid a certification across the table and set a pen beside it, and told Harlan Cudahy that as the officer who signed the payroll he was required to certify the sum owed and authorize back pay to every affected worker within 30 days. Cudahy picked up the pen. His hand shook. Not from age. He looked once down the wall at the bench where his own men sat watching him. Sam, 30 years, never missed a day. Owen, docked for the rain. And then he looked back down at the paper and he could not meet their eyes, and he signed it. He signed $58,900 in front of every man he'd stolen it from, without ever lifting a finger himself. That was his sentence. Not a cell. That signature, in that light, with those men watching. A proud man is punished by other men seeing exactly what he is. Harlan Cudahy will carry that room to his grave. And the crew. I told you about the floor scene. I told you how 24 men stood silent while Vernon fired a 19-year-old boy for asking where his $6 went. You want your minutes? Go count them somewhere else. 24 men heard that, and none of them could do a thing. Because a job at Corliss was a job, and the clock was the clock, and you don't argue with the clock. Now they sat on a bench and watched the clock argue back. Nobody cheered. That's not how those men were built. But I watched Sam put his hand over his mouth. I watched Owen lean forward with his elbows on his knees and his head down, and his shoulders moved, once, and Marge reached over and put one of her 2 hands flat on his back. The rest just sat there and looked at the boxes on the table with their years written on the side. And I think for the first time in a long time, those men felt like the hours of their lives had weighed something after all. That somebody had been counting. That somebody always had been. And at the door, because the Bureau's order had brought him back, stood Petey Malloy. He'd come in late, quiet, hat in his hands. He stood in the same doorway where Vernon had fired him. He didn't say anything. He was 19, and he didn't have words for a room like that. He just watched. I picked up the tin. I opened it. And I took out the one card I'd kept on top all these years. The first one I ever caught. And I walked it down to the end of the table, and I set it in front of Sifford by itself. This is the first one, I said. Card number 0714. Petey Malloy's first night on the floor. I turned it so the light caught the corner. You can still see the grease on the corner where he held it. You dated it yourself, Vernon, top right. That's your hand. Vernon didn't look at it. But Petey did. From the doorway, that boy looked at his own first card sitting on a state examiner's table 9 years, no, his first night. His card. And his eyes came up and found mine across that whole room, and he gave me the smallest nod, and I gave it back. And that was all. That was the whole thank you, both directions, and it was plenty. Ruth speaks only twice, I'd promised myself. And I did. Everything else was the paper. A document on a table. A stamped date. 26 years of a rubber date stamp, and a good memory, and in the end that was heavier than a man who thought nobody was keeping time. I retired in June. They wanted to do something for me, and I told them no. I didn't want a cake in the break room. I'd spent 26 years being the woman nobody watched, and I found I wanted to leave the same way, quiet, out the front, past Irene, into my Rambler with the empty trunk. But I'll tell you how it settled, because you'll want to know. And because the story isn't the hearing. The hearing is just the loud part. The story is what the hours were worth all along. The back pay went out inside the 30 days. It came in the mail, most of it a plain envelope in 24 mailboxes across Delano and the county around it. I heard Sam paid off the last of a hospital bill from 2 winters back, the one for his wife. I heard Owen bought his boy a bicycle and never told him why there was suddenly money for a bicycle in the spring. $6 a week doesn't sound like much. 9 years of $6 a week, handed back all at once, sounds like a great deal. And it was. Petey Malloy signed on again as an apprentice welder. 12 days after the hearing he was back on the floor, and he made full welder by fall. He works under the new night superintendent now. That's Margaret Dockery, Marge Two Hands, promoted off the line to run the whole shift, and I will tell you the cards come in clean now, every one, full-time, grease on the corners and all. She counts the men herself. Old habits. Good ones. Vernon Holt is gone, awaiting trial, last I heard, on the wage fraud charges. The E. Dunmore line is struck from the books, a name that never belonged to a man, erased from a ledger that finally tells the truth. They tell me he asked, somewhere near the end, whether it was really true that the card lady had read the labor code before she filed. Whether a woman who brought his coffee with 2 sugars had actually sat down with the state statutes and read them. I had. Cover to cover. 2 hours to Columbus and back, and a good many evenings at my kitchen table, besides. It's not a long book. Quiet people read the fine print. That's the whole thing, right there. That's what none of them ever counted on. Cudahy took early retirement. There was no charge for him. The state doesn't jail a man for not reading, but he doesn't come into town much anymore, and when he does, the men who got that envelope in the mail have a way of looking at him that I imagine is worse than any fine. He signed his name to what he was. You can't unsign a thing like that. As for me, I take my coffee on my own porch now. 2 sugars, out of habit, though there's nobody to bring it to but myself. And I find I don't mind that at all. The mornings come in over the yard slow and gold, and I sit and I listen to the town wake up, and I don't punch anybody's card and nobody punches mine. The tin is on the shelf in the front room. Empty now. The cards live in a state file in Columbus, sealed, where they'll outlast all of us. But I kept the tin. I like the look of it up there, catching the light. A little red can that held 9 years of the truth in the false bottom of a furnace room box, 30 feet from the man who ordered it burned. He never once looked at what I was carrying when I left the building. That was his whole undoing, and it never had anything to do with me being clever. It had to do with him deciding, a long time ago, that I was nobody worth watching. A clock only lies for the man who thinks nobody's keeping time. Vernon Holt thought that for 9 years. He was wrong for every minute of them, and the minutes were the very thing that hung him. So here's what I know, sitting on my porch with the coffee going cool. They can shave your hours. They can dock you for standing out of the rain. They can tap the wall clock and tell a boy to argue with it, and fire him when he does, and count on 24 tired men staying quiet because a job is a job. They can do all of that for years and call it drift. But somewhere in the building there is usually somebody nobody watches. Somebody with a rubber stamp and a good memory and a drawer they never let anyone into. And that person is keeping time, whether the boss believes it or not. The quiet ones read the fine print. The card lady kept the cards. That's the story of the honest clock at Corliss Stamping Works in Delano, Ohio, in the autumn of 1971. I've told it the way it happened, cover to cover, nothing shaved off the ends. If you've got a Vernon Holt in your town, a boss who's sure nobody's counting, tell me where you're watching from. Comment your city. I want to see just how far a story about an honest clock can travel.